On the 30th of September 1938, Neville Chamberlain, then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, landed on the aerodrome in Heston and triumphantly explained that he believes he brought peace for our time. He has just returned from an international conference which was held in Munich with the participation of France, the United Kingdom, Germany and Italy. The conference, which is also referred to as the Munich Accord, was brokered by Mussolini, the leader of fascist Italy, who wanted to prevent war, which was looming in the air after Hitler demanded that Czechoslovakia cedes a territory called the Sudetenland, a territory along the border of Czechia, which was then primarily inhabited by Germans. Czechoslovakia was in an alliance with the United Kingdom and France, so had Germany attacked the Czechoslovakia, this would have led to a major war, because also the United Kingdom and France would get involved. Italy was in an alliance with Germany already back then, but Mussolini didn't really want a big war to break out, at least not just yet. Against that background, quite many people were relieved when Neville Chamberlain came back and said, well, I brokered peace for our time. After all, World War I has ended just 20 years prior, so most people still remembered that horrible event which was the bloodiest war in the history of Europe until that time. Consequently, one might think that the Munich Accord was a good thing. There's just one tiny problem. As I mentioned, the participants of the conference were France, United Kingdom, Germany and Italy. Not Czechoslovakia. But the main point of the Munich Accord was that Czechoslovakia was supposed to give up said contested territory, the Sudetenland. This constellation should be, at the very least, odd. You know, a decision was made about a sovereign country. A decision was made that they are supposed to lose territory, but they haven't even been at the negotiation table. More than that, if you take into consideration Czechoslovakia was in an alliance with France and the United Kingdom, their allies negotiating with their potential enemy that they are supposed to give up territory seems like betrayal? Now, some of you may already know that, others may not, but this is exactly why the Munich Accord is also sometimes referred to as the betrayal by the West. But let's leave aside the moral judgment of the situation. Let's go back to the first point I mentioned, namely that at the very least it's odd. Usually when a country is supposed to gain a territory or lose territory, they sit at the negotiation table, right? We all know statements like "no taxation without representation," which was one of the slogans that rallied people in the back then 13 colonies in North America prior to the American War of Independence, or a broader slogan like "nothing about us without us." And I guess that most of us will get behind that logic. I mean, at the very least, when we're talking about mentally sane adults, we expect that no decisions are made about us without us. We would also agree that sovereign countries should always have a say about their fate. They should be at the negotiation table, even if they are supposed to lose something, or maybe in particular when they are supposed to lose territory or the like. That begs the question, what happened here? Why have the United Kingdom and the Republic of France decided to broker a deal with Hitler's Nazi Germany without asking Czechoslovakia? There is a Polish expression that something is being done ponad głowami, literally above someone's head. I tried to figure out if there is a proper counterpart to that, but apparently there is none. There are expressions like doing something behind someone's back, but this is rather a case where the person concerned isn't in the know. They don't know that a decision has been taken about them by two other parties. Ponad głowami is more like you being a child standing between your parents and your father and your mother just discuss what's going to happen with you, but you don't even get a say. You are there and you know exactly that they are talking to each other, but they just ignore you. Your point of view is not being taken into account. There is no English counterpart to that, apparently. You can say that people discuss above someone's head, but then again, this is more understood like you don't get it. It's, it goes over someone's head, right? That's the expression. So that also doesn't really fit. I guess you understand why this Polish expression came to my mind, because that's exactly how the Czechs and Slovaks must have felt. They knew that there were negotiations going on, and they were simply not invited. Decisions were made about them, profound decisions, to add insult to injury, decisions made not by like two of their enemies, but no, one side of those negotiations were supposed to be their friends, their allies, right? And their allies were negotiating directly with their enemies, and they agreed to a negative outcome for them. That begs the question, how did that even happen? Why did two civilized countries like the United Kingdom and France decide to treat their own ally like this? I guess the answer is the concert of powers. The concert of powers is the concept that profound decisions about international politics are to be made between the most powerful nations in the world. And smaller nations simply have to comply with whatever those big powers decide. They decided, for instance, that the Dukedom of Warsaw would be split up, with the Poles getting no say. They decided that the Spanish Netherlands would become a part of the Republic of the Netherlands, again, without asking their inhabitants. Equally, they have redrawn various other borders in Europe, for instance in northern Italy, always not asking the peoples involved. For a long time, this is just how things have been done, and not just in Europe, but on a global scale. The big empires decided among themselves how borders should be drawn, which peoples should be under whose influence, or which empire would simply get to have a colony or simply gain territory directly to the motherland. The big change in the philosophy how international politics should be happened after World War II with the establishment of the United Nations. The United Nations have been the brainchild of the United States, which wanted to bring an end to this type of making politics. After the establishment of the United Nations, the new approach is that every country should be sovereign. There should no longer be colonies, there should no longer be countries which are just protectorates or the like, or under anyone else's suzerainty. Also, most importantly, waging war should no longer be a means by which international politics are being carried out. Against that background, everyone, even those of you who support Trump's decision to negotiate directly with Putin, should be at least concerned by the fact that this also means a step back of more than 50 years, going back to a type of doing international politics as has been the case before World War II. And if the argument that Trump is basically going back to a style of doing international politics from more than 70 years ago doesn't concern you as such, then maybe this argument will. After Neville Chamberlain triumphantly exclaimed that he brought peace for our time, World War II broke out almost exactly a year later. This is the background against which I come to the conclusion that, looking at what Trump is doing right now, European countries should establish a European army. If you'd like to know what my reasoning is, here we go. It doesn't make sense to set a goal which is not obtainable. For that reason, the first argument I would make in favor of creating the world's strongest armed forces in Europe is that we can. Now, many of you might shake your head in disbelief and think, wait a second, that's not possible. I mean, the United States are spending more than the next, 10 countries combined? And aren't they like decades ahead in weapons development? Well, let's break it down to the basics. If you want to have the world's strongest armed forces, you need basically three things. First, you need a large population. Secondly, you need a strong economy. And thirdly, you need the technology. Let's go through those 3 points together. This is the size of the population in the United States, and this is the population of the European Union. And this is the population of the European countries which are part of NATO. Now, most of the countries of the European Union are also members of NATO, and most European NATO members are in the EU. But quite notably, the United Kingdom is in NATO but left the European Union. For those reasons, I would show both statistics because it is both possible and realistic to create unified European armed forces either as part of the EU or as part of the European branch of NATO. But in either case, you see, whether it would be an EU army or if it would be a European NATO army, the population of the European countries involved is larger than that of the United States. Why is that relevant? Well, you cannot create strong armed forces with technology alone. A great example to demonstrate that is Saudi Arabia, which is a country which has a lot of petrodollars, but they cannot possibly dominate the region militarily simply because their army cannot be big. It cannot be big because they don't have enough population. Now, a little side note, you might have realized that the Russo-Ukrainian war has very much accelerated the development of drones. Not just flying drones, but also drones that move on the ground, as well as drones which are diving or swimming on the water surface. So we are slowly moving towards robo-wars of the future. But I assume that at the very least for the next years, probably for the next decades, wars will still predominantly be fought by actual people in the field. For that reason, the statement that I made at the beginning is still true. If you want to have a strong military, it has to be numerous to some extent, and for that reason, you need a large population. And this condition would clearly be met by a European alliance of countries willing to create a unified European army. So let's move on to the next point, having a strong economy. You cannot have a strong military without a strong economy. Why? Well, because you cannot just send unarmed soldiers into the fighting. Well, you could, but you would just waste them. As a matter of fact, as military technology progresses, having good equipment becomes more and more important. There's just one problem. Military equipment is extremely expensive. Do you think a Lamborghini is expensive? Look at how much this fighter costs. Look at how much this tank costs. Or just look at how much a single rocket of this type costs. For that reason, you cannot have the world's strongest military without also having the world's strongest economy. Now, as you can see on this chart, the gross domestic product of the United States of America is currently larger than that of the European Union. However, when you look at the historical development, you can see that EU and US are more or less on par. Sometimes the EU having the bigger economy, sometimes the US having it. So, despite the economic problems that various countries of the EU are facing right now, I would say that the EU and the US are more or less on par when it comes to GDP. Which brings us to the third point, technology. Is the European arms industry even able to produce weapons and equipment that's on par with that of the United States, or to surpass them? Well, decide for yourself. Now, I don't want to overburden this video by analyzing every single area of technology that's relevant for a modern army, but let's single out the following: tanks, airplanes, artillery systems, ships, and anti-ballistic missiles. Now, the good news is that despite the European arms industry being much smaller than that of the United States, when it comes to the quality of weapons systems developed in Europe, they are pretty much on par with that of the United States. When you look for the 5 best weapon systems from each of the categories that I just mentioned, you will almost always equally find US-made systems as European systems. Just have a look at tanks, where Leopard 2s are generally considered to be even better than the Abrams tanks. Have a look at airplanes, where the United States lead, but it's not that the European systems are outside of the top 5. Here are tubed artillery systems, artillery rocket systems, aircraft carriers, submarines, destroyers and frigates. And last but not least, the increasingly important anti-ballistic missile systems. Now, when we look closer at the examples which I gave, it becomes clear that trying to overtake the United States, or at least to be on par, would not be without challenges. After all, there seems to be no system manufacturer in Europe that is on par with US-American ABM systems. Also, the reason why there are ship and submarine designs in Europe which are on par with that of the United States is thanks to the United Kingdom, which is not part of the European Union anymore. On the other hand, I think that the examples prove the point that the European arms industry is definitely capable to do better. In some areas, they just would need to churn out bigger amounts of the weapon systems they already developed. In other areas, they would still have to develop them. But looking at the fact that the European arms industry is capable of creating systems which are on par or superior to that of the United States already now, it should be clear that Europe has the tech and the know-how to develop weapon systems also in those areas where Europe is limping behind. So I hope that I can prove the first point, that Europe could build the strongest military in the world. Which brings us to the next point: should we? I guess I will not surprise you if I say yes, we should. After all, I gave it away at the beginning of the video. And I would say that there are 3 reasons. Number 1, Russia. Number 2, China. And number 3, unfortunately, the United States. Now, Russia is obvious. When numbers started to come in that after Putin took over power in 2000, more and more of the petrodollars that Russia was making at that time started to be funneled into the military, many people, most people, haven't really woken up to the possibility of Russia taking a more aggressive stance in the future. When Russia paralyzed Estonia's critical IT infrastructure for several days, still most people didn't want to accept that Russia has become a threat to the West, including to countries being a part of NATO. When Putin restarted Russian strategic bombers carrying nuclear weapons flying along the coast of the United States again, some people called it a return to the Cold War. And yet, a majority of people didn't want to acknowledge that Russia might actually become a danger to Europe. It was a somewhat bigger shock when in 2008 Russia then started an actual war by attacking Georgia. And still, in most countries in Europe, the general public, just as much as the majority of the politicians, didn't really think that this is anything that might ever concern them. More interestingly, when Russia attacked a country in the westwards direction, in our European direction, namely the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, still many people didn't really believe that this is something that might be a danger to other European countries or to Europe in general. Only after the 24th of February 2022, when Russia attacked Ukraine again, this time admitting that it's their army, not like in 2014 where they pretended that it's just local insurgents which have taken over Crimea and parts of the Donbass, only in 2022 did the majority, both of the general public as of the European politicians, wake up and realize that Russia has returned to imperialist policies. And still, a majority of policymakers in Europe does not seem to understand that Russia's new imperialist policy is not just a threat to Ukraine, or maybe also to the Baltic states, or maybe also to the countries of the former Eastern Bloc, but to every single country in Europe as far west as you can go. Maybe that's because they still don't know that one of the political philosophers who influences the Russian political establishment is Dugin, who advocates the conquest of Europe.
Общество, и в первую очередь государство, решит, принять его или нет. Идея такая, что нам надо захватить Европу, завоевать и присоединить.
Maybe it's because their secret services have failed to inform them that Putin likes to cite this Russian philosopher, because if they would understand that Putin considers the entire West as a threat to Russia. But most importantly, most European leaders probably thought we don't have to worry as long as the strong arm of the United States is protecting us. Only now that Donald Trump basically said, Europe, you're on your own, have many people in Europe woken up to the fact that we have to indeed care for ourselves. And that's why European leaders, which would want to safeguard their countries against the threat of being potentially conquered by Russia, have to pool their resources and to create a military that would be strong enough either to repel a Russian attack or, ideally, to deter Russia from even trying. But Russia is not the only threat that Europe should take into consideration. China's Communist Party is one of the worst dictatorships that have ever existed in the history of mankind. After all, they are literally killing dissidents just to sell their organs. And no, what I'm telling you is not a dystopian nightmare, this is a dystopian reality. There is literally a United Nations report on this phenomenon. But why the Chinese Communist Party killing members of the Falun Gong movement is not a threat to European security, China's geopolitical ambitions are. Admittedly, China is remote. Also, Europe does not have seemed to come into the crosshairs of the strategical thinkers in China so far. However, China does have global ambitions, and they are malevolent. Most importantly, the Chinese Communist Party fundamental position paper is anti-democratic and anti-rule of law. Yes, democratic countries with rule of law in Europe are considered by the Chinese Communist Party as the enemy. Given that China is in the process of a massive military buildup with the goal of out-arming the United States of America, it would be better for Europe to build up a military that would be at the very least on par. Last but not least, I did not expect that to happen, but the United States of America have turned from the country that seemed to secure peace and independence of Europe to a country that threatens it. Now, some people would argue that this isn't something new. After all, many people have been pointing out a deep hypocrisy in how the United States behave. They see themselves as the champion for democracy, freedom, and rule of law, but at the same time they have been meddling with internal affairs of various countries, unfortunately very often with horrible results. They have made the putsch in Chile carried out by General Pinochet possible in the first place. The result was the rule of a very cruel junta. One of those cruel elements was that they disappeared people, meaning they didn't officially arrest them and officially sentence them to death and officially execute them. But no, they would secretly obtain them, torture them, and then they would fly them out into the Pacific Ocean, throw them out of helicopters into the sea, hundreds of kilometers away from this coast. And they would never even inform the family that their family members have been killed. So for decades, people were left with this feeling, maybe my family members are still alive. And mind you, the previous head of government was democratically elected, so the United States should have accepted the decision of the people. But they didn't. The same is true for Persia/Iran. There too, there was a democratically elected head of the government who was then deposed in a putsch in which the Shah took over absolute power. And yes, the Shah's rule in Iran was also very cruel, where the Secret Service was known for its ruthlessness. Little side note, if you wonder why the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran and why the Mullah regime calls the United States the big devil, well, that's the reason. Another example is Nicaragua, where the left-leaning Sandinistas came to power, and the United States have funded guerrillas, the so-called Contras, which led to a very long, also bloody civil war. However, these are all examples which do not directly involve Europe. So Europe had the privilege of being able to vote left-leaning governments into power in France, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, without being invaded by the United States of America. So it is easy to forget about that and not to consider the United States as a threat. Another case where people could say that the United States should have always been regarded as a threat to freedom and independence is the International Criminal Court. The basic idea of the International Criminal Court is that it doesn't matter if you committed crimes while being the head of a state. If you committed crimes, you should be prosecuted. You can consider the ICC as being some sort of permanent Nuremberg tribunal, just not limited to people from one country, but to the entire world. Now, you might think that this is an idea that the United States should get behind full-heartedly, but they don't. The United States have sabotaged the ICC as much as they could. They have even passed a law that penalizes every country that collaborates with the ICC. Then again, European countries are exempt from this harsh treatment, so it was something one could easily overlook. But if you too, like the majority of people in Europe, had the illusion that the United States cannot possibly be a threat to Europe's security, just think about Greenland. Trump has literally called the Danish government and demanded the cession of Greenland. One country demanding from another country that they just turn over territory and threatening them even with military force. That's a return to pre-United Nations imperialist policies. It's a return to the concert of powers, where the big powers in the world decide about the fate of small countries like Denmark. Now maybe you like the idea of the concert of powers, maybe you follow some of the arguments which have been made already back then, namely that only the big powers can guarantee a certain order. You might say, let's look this ugly truth in the eye and base our actions on this reality. But you know what? It doesn't even matter if we approve of the idea of a concert of powers or if we are against it. In either case, it is an argument for European countries to create a joint military. If you are against a concert of powers where the big nations just clarify things among themselves and just ignore what the small countries want to do and what their interests are or what they are legally entitled to based on the UN Charter, well, then it's logical that those small countries have to get together to become strong enough so that they can stand up to any attempts to just talk above their heads and make decisions without them. Equally, if you approve of the concept of the concert of powers, isn't it better for every European country if Europe becomes one instrument in that concert? I would say definitely yes. We do, unfortunately, live in interesting times. By the way, I allude to a Chinese saying, which is something of a curse, which is may you live in interesting times. Because, you know, times of prosperity and peace are boring, whereas exciting times, historically speaking, are unfortunately such with a lot of instability and dangers and a lot of suffering to individuals. It's a saying that shows a lot of wisdom and historical understanding. So yes, we live in those exciting and interesting times, and it can get very ugly for every single one of us. Now some of you might say, oh come on, that's just Trump and this crazy talk. But that doesn't really matter. The problem is, his crazy talk did not cause a wave of consternation in the United States. It's not that basically the entire country gasped and said, our leader has gone crazy. Had that happened, then one could indeed say, okay, that's just him, it's just Trump. But that's not how the country has reacted. Just as much as Trump has turned various things which were unthinkable before him into reality, this is yet another one. This is the United States talking to another country, in this case even a NATO ally, like a 19th century empire did talk to a country that was supposed to become a protectorate. It's like Britain or France negotiating with a country like Egypt or Algeria and telling them, you will become our protectorate or else. Or it's like either of these two countries or any other empire of the age of imperialism telling a minor nation that they have to cede territory or face a military invasion. It doesn't have to come to a military invasion of Greenland by the United States. The fact alone that this is not entirely unthinkable means that the United States of America too have become a threat to the security of Europe. This is why the only way for Europe to secure its freedom, independence, sovereignty, rule of law is to arm itself, and the only way that this is possible is to pool resources. Because no single country in Europe, even the biggest and most populous ones with the biggest economic output, which is Germany, is capable of standing up against the big powers of this world on their own. So let's move to the next point. You might say, nice and well, but there are quite some arguments why this will never happen. And indeed, there is a long list of aspects that would be challenges to the creation of a joint military of Europe. Let's start with national pride. Having your own armed forces is a hallmark of independence and sovereignty, just as much as having your own flag, a coat of arms, and an anthem. Also look at the sometimes very long history of military traditions and the symbolism. Polish armed forces look back at a history of 1,000 years of military engagement. They are looking back at iconic units like the famous winged hussars, which today are still a symbol of the armored corps. The Polish army is proud of its idiosyncrasies, like being the only army where you salute with your two fingers, like in the Boy Scouts. It is also the only army to have hats which are rectangular, the so-called rogatywka. Or look at the German army. You probably know about the Iron Cross, das Eiserne Kreuz. Or look at the British military, where every regiment looks back at the long history of peculiarities and traditions. And these are just 3 examples from the top of my head. I'm sure that every country in Europe which has armed forces is looking at a host of traditions and symbols which they cherish. Wouldn't creating a unified European army mean to give up on that? Let me put this into perspective. When I was a child, I was convinced that basically every country not only has a national anthem and a coat of arms and a flag, but they also have their national airway line, their national railway line, their national currency, their national postal service, and so on. A lot has changed since then. Some countries still have their national airways, but often they are privatized. Sometimes they don't exist anymore. Very often they are part of a supranational, privately owned corporation. For that reason, for instance, the British Airways, once they were privatized under Thatcher, took away the Union Jack from the symbol of the British Airways. Sticking with Britain, British Railways is no more either. The national railways have been broken up into private companies and exist no more. But maybe the best example is national currencies. I could hardly fathom that a moment would come when countries like France would give up on their national currencies, which is literally called franc, after the francs and France and the whole nation. And Germans would give up on the cherished Deutschmark. An important aspect of my youth, which was that every country, just like it had its own coat of arms and so on, it also had its currency. You had lira in Italy, and you had pesos in Spain, and you had, well, Deutschmark and franc and so on. And this has been given up in favor of a joint currency. Economic advantages trumped national pride. A strong, stable currency proved to be more important. And the aspect of symbolism has been dealt with. Yes, the euro banknotes do not feature famous people because it would be difficult to find a consensus among 27 countries. There are less euro. Not all EU countries are using the euro yet, but you know what I'm talking about. Finding a consensus would have been difficult, so they agreed on admittedly somewhat boring buildings. But we did find a way. For that reason, I think we could work out the technicalities of symbolism and medals and so on. The more important part is, if we can give up national currencies for the sake of more wealth, we definitely should also be able to give up national militaries for the sake of staying independent and safe. The second counter-argument that you could make is, you will never get all countries in Europe to agree on such a plan. Just think about pro-Russian countries like Hungary right now. Never will you reach a consensus. But you know what? Even in EU law, there is a provision that could solve this issue, which is called enhanced cooperation. That term doesn't sound like much, but it was very important when it was introduced, and there was quite some controversy if it should be. And particularly in Germany, there was a discussion if this wouldn't create a Europe of two different speeds, that some countries could cooperate more than others. But it was a way to find a way around of situations where a veto-based system would create deadlock. What it means is that EU law officially allows a part of the member states of the European Union to create common mechanisms which function within the administrative system of the European Union, despite the fact that they do not have to include all member states. This means that within the European Union you could create something like a coalition of the willing, that a part of the countries of the European Union could decide to fuse their military forces. More than that, as I alluded to in the beginning, a European army wouldn't have to be based on the European Union. It could be based on a coalition of countries in Europe which are part of NATO. The advantage being that, for instance, the United Kingdom could join such a joint army without being part of the European Union. But the takeaway is that you do not need an all-European consensus in order to create a unified European army. Obviously, it would be true to say the more the merrier, that it wouldn't be that one country could veto starting this project. Which brings us to the most important challenge to a unified European army. Money and the perception of threat. Do you remember when Trump stopped demanding that all NATO states should not just fulfill the already agreed goal of 2% of GDP for military spending and move towards 5% of GDP as military spending? Interestingly, it was a Russian analysis which grouped European countries into three categories. For one, those countries which are adjacent to Russia, which didn't need to be told that they have to increase their spending because they already were spending, or at least intend to increase their spending to 5% of the GDP. We're talking about countries like Poland, like Finland, or like the Baltic countries. Then we have big, industrialized, wealthy countries in the middle of Europe which do not fulfill the 2% goal necessarily already and are rather unwilling to increase it to 5%. They feel relatively safe because they are in the middle and because they are relatively strong economically and also militarily. So we're talking about Germany, France, Italy, and also the United Kingdom. Worse, there are countries which are the furthest away from Russia, countries like Spain or like Portugal, where Spain, for instance, doesn't even meet the 2% goal with only 1.5 as far as I understand. If the general public of these countries and their political leaders do not have a sense of urgency and do not really think that they are endangered by Russian expansionism, it's no surprise that they were unwilling to increase military spending. Therefore, it seems even less likely to carry out such a humongous step like giving up your national military in favor of a unified European military, right? Well, as I said, this is probably the biggest challenge to the project of having a unified army. Will the public and the political leaders understand that Russian expansionism, as well as China's military ambitions, as well as the erratic policy of the United States, pose a threat to the safety and security of European nations? As I said before, we live in interesting times. We live in a time of instability, and things are going to get even more crazy and unstable in the decades to come. Europe needs a strong military to safeguard its own future. More and more people start to understand that, most importantly the political leaders. And the fact that European leaders got together after Trump's various statements and after Trump having started negotiations directly with Russia above the heads of Ukraine and the rest of Europe is a good sign. One of the reasons why I make this video is to contribute to a change of perception of the security risk that we all are facing right now. I hope that we, the general public in Europe, will not just endorse the idea of a unified European army, but also going to push undecided politicians in that direction. For that reason, I have a request. If you think that this video could be interesting to someone else, recommend it to him. Yes, I know, everybody's saying like, comment and subscribe, but I think that direct recommendation is a more powerful tool. Otherwise, I'm curious what you're going to say in the comments, and see you in the next video.